Mr. Tran Van Huong facing the danger of losing his country. Being a military man during the last days of South Vietnam, I had a chance of being close to Mr. Huong, particularly during the turmoil when the capital of Saigon was surrounded during the last days of April 1975. The situation was urgent after President Nguyen Bang Thieu resigned on April 21st, 1975, and handed over his power to Mr. Tran Van Huong according to the Constitution. Mr. Tran Van Huong accepted the supreme position to lead the country in a very difficult situation. On one hand, he was under the heavy pressure of America, who wanted to soon withdraw from Vietnam. On the other hand, the enemy, the North Communists, was aware of the total weakness of South Vietnam after being abandoned by the U.S. and had increased their pressure by sending more troops to Saigon. In addition, the pro-communist actors in South Vietnam government used the pressure to overthrow the government in order to replace it with a communist-controlled government. 7 days after taking over the power from President Nguyen Bang Thieu, Mr. Tran Van Huong had to hand over his power to General Nguyen Bang Minh. It happened as follows. April 21st, 1975, President Thieu resigned. Mr. Tran Van Huong took over the role as President of the Republic of Vietnam. April 26, 1975, Ambassador Martin met with Mr. Huong and informed him of the pressure from the Northern Communists and their ability to attack Saigon. April 27, 1975, the Vietnamese Assembly met and voted for the transferring of power to General Nguyen Bang Minh. April 28, 1975, at 5 p.m., Mr. Tran Van Huong handed over his power to General Nguyen Bang Minh by the decision of the National Assembly. The speech that President Tran Van Huong read at the National Assembly on April 26, 1975, revealed that he was under the strong pressure of the U.S. and the North Vietnam Communists, by which General Nguyen Bang Minh was instituted as a political strategy to do away with the South Vietnam government. Let us remember what Mr. Huong expressed in his historic speech at the National Assembly. Mr. Huong indicated that he only wanted to designate General Nguyen Bang Minh as Prime Minister, but General Nguyen Bang Minh insisted that Mr. Huong should hand over him the power as President so that he could negotiate with the other side. But General Nguyen Bang Minh decidedly requested to be assigned as President and refused to take over the role as Prime Minister. General said, "You have sacrificed to that moment. Now we request you one more time to sacrifice one more time in handing power to me." Under the pressure from all sides, Mr. Huong decided to hold the current power of government of the South Vietnam according to the Constitution of the Second Republic of Vietnam. Mr. Huong expressed as follows. Despite the fact that Vietnam has lost significantly, its basic legality still exists. The National Assembly still exists. The Constitution still exists. So I could not do anything to surpass the National Assembly and violate the Constitution. However, the power that I have in my hands is the power decided by the Constitution. It is not a handkerchief. It is not a bill from my hands that I could take and give you at any time. I could not do it like that. I have to report to the National Assembly for decision. Before transferring his power to General Nguyen Bang Minh, Mr. Huong seemed to be doubtful about the role of General Minh in negotiations. He said, "Gentlemen, General thinks that he could negotiate with the adversaries because they can talk to him. I could not believe in it until I see the exact proof. But I think in this case you must be the person who has been entrusted by the National Assembly for the negotiation." Mr. Huong insisted, "I would not accept the preconditions imposed by the other party at their will." After showing the Assembly members the danger of losing the country if the Assembly members accepted General Nguyen Bang Minh, if the Assembly would not accept it, then the South Vietnam would continue fighting. He said, "If you would not accept it, then the South Vietnam would continue fighting." He said, "If you would not accept it because the condition is excessive, a condition of winners imposed on the losers, in this case we have no other choice than to fight to the end, despite of the fact that the city of Saigon will turn into the Sea of Blood." But finally, following the majority of the pro-peace group of the National Assembly, Mr. Huong had to hand over his power to General Nguyen Bang Minh. After the transfer of power, Mr. Huong went back to his office, and after that he went back to his private home on a narrow alley on Phang Thanh Street. During the period of 7 days as president, he was under great pressure coming from all directions. I thought he had neither time for resting peacefully nor mental relaxation. His security staff close to him worried for his health. Even after handing power to General Yung Veng-min, he could still not live in peace. On April 29, 1975, he still received American Ambassador Martin. In these successive changing situations of the military pressures, the vice president office was placed under 100% curfew like most of military offices in Saigon. On April 29, 1975, I was a military officer on duty. The defensive force at the vice president's office was usually the defensive force of the honor security groups. Sometimes it was also reinforced with police forces according to the situation. The vice president's office has an active force with about 100 military men of all ranks. The office of vice president is situated on a square area surrounded by Tu Sung, Công Lý, Hình Vương, and Lê Quý Đôn streets. The last days of April, the families living in the houses around on the streets surrounded the vice president's residence evacuated. At that moment, in the sky, the helicopters from the 7th Fleet continuously helped to evacuate the American personnel and people relating to the American government. On the political view, the transitional group of Yung Veng-min began their work by appealing to the people in the country to be calm and wait for a solution of agreement and unification with North Vietnam on the national broadcasting stations. At that moment, the enemy was approaching closer and closer to Saigon. There was fighting between some military units of the 18th Infantry Division against North Vietnamese forces to stop their advances to Saigon. In such a situation, I made a contact to the Brigadier General Ly Ba-hee, Deputy Commander of Capital Military Zone. He said to me, "Frankly speaking, I have to tell you that we are preparing to fight with the enemy in Saigon in a few hours. They were moving very fast to attack our capital." I have also contacted with the Military Joint Staff and the 3rd Military Corps Zone. They have the same troubles. Only the 4th Military Corps Zone was in a ready position to fight. Since General Yung Veng-min replaced Mr. Huong, I had to take care of one more person, who is Mr. Tran Van Huong, Vice President of the Republic of Vietnam. Lieutenant Colonel Lam Bang, Chief of the Military Service Department at the Vice President's office, contacted Mr. Huong at his residence. At the request of Lieutenant Colonel Lam Bang, I sent an infantry platoon to protect Mr. Huong at his residence. Then the defensive force for the Vice President is simply a company under the command of Major Hoy. Seeing the enemy forces moving to Saigon, the forces of the 3rd Corps regrouped, some tank units going back to Saigon. I think there will be a face-to-face fight with the North Regular Army with the support of tanks. They would shoot to destroy key positions, the leading organ of the Republic of Vietnam, when they entered the capital of Saigon. I worried when I looked back to the remaining forces in the Vice President's residence with the weapons that were inferior to those of the enemies who used tanks to attack the Vice President's residence. Facing this serious situation, I presented it to our highest leader, Lieutenant Colonel Chief of the Military Division of Vice President Palace. After hearing such a situation, Lieutenant Colonel did not say a word, and 20 minutes afterward, I heard the noise of the engine of helicopters that remained with the Vice President. The helicopter of the Vice President took off. Automatically, the communication unit of the military department of the Vice President's palace called to make a contact with the helicopter. I was surprised because the helicopter took off shortly after the engine started, as it was an emergency. When the telecommunication called the signal of the Lieutenant Colonel Chief of Military Department, there was no answers as usual. My feelings let me know the Lieutenant Colonel had used the last helicopter to flee. I knew that the escape of the leader of the military department would make the remaining officers shake. To avoid this situation, I called the telecommunication unit to let them know that the Lieutenant Colonel had a special mission and did not have any instrument for communication, so no contact was needed. I told the telecommunication operators to inform all officers to come to the meeting, and I went to the office. At that time, I tried to contact Lieutenant Colonel Lam Thang, who was working at Mr. Nguyen Van Huong's house. Lieutenant Colonel Thang told me that he was so busy that he could not come. He asked me to take care of everything. When it came to the meeting room, I met Captain Van Huong, Chief Service of Security, who was already there with a number of other officers. Captain Gung let me know that surely Lieutenant Colonel Chief of Military Department of Vice President Palace already used the last helicopter of Mr. Huong to escape in a hurry. I was the only one as major, so I entered the meeting room and announced that we were moments away from a fight. I called everybody to keep our spirit unshakable to fulfill the responsibility of military men. Captain Kung and I discussed to find the best way to protect the safety of Mr. Tran Van Huong. In reality, I saw that our forces and weapons were not efficient enough to counter the enemy. The regular army of the Northern Communists was better equipped with the support of tanks. It must be difficult to protect Mr. Huong. I discussed with Captain Gung to look for secret places that only we knew of to hide Mr. Huong before taking him to a western province before Saigon is attacked. Before having this idea, I had contacted Brigadier General Liang Wenlong, commanding the Airborne Division, and another friend of mine, Major Tran Van Huong. Hua was the Airborne Battalion commander, and his battalion was stationed in Thao Garden. The two of us exchanged signals of communication. Brigadier General Lung and I were born in Binyang. General Lung said to me, "Keep contact with me and let me know his intention. Hua and me will take him to the western region to be close to Major General Wang Quanam. Let me know right away his decision." I would like to mention that Brigadier General Lung was my brother's classmate, who considers me as his younger brother. With the great support of Brigadier General Lung, I felt as if I was catching a float. I told Gung about this important moment. Captain Gung was Mr. Huong's nephew. Both of us came to see Mr. Huong unexpectedly the night of April 28, 1975. Captain Gung told Mr. Huong that I wanted to see him to present him a plan to protect him. Mr. Huong invited me to come in and listened to my presentation. After my presentation, Mr. Huong stood up and tapped my forehead lightly. He said, "You have the responsibility of a leader, so you have the right to make all decisions. But for myself, you do not worry about me." He said again, "I understand that you are military men. It is very hard, but I am very sad because I could not do anything better. In the long run, I wish everything would be better." I said that I could not do anything better. I stood up and went back to my work. I got in touch with the Brigadier General Liang Wenlong and let him know that our plan was not successful. General Lung had a high respect to Mr. Huong. From April 29, 1975 to April 30, 1975, I stayed permanently at the division. During these 2 days, the military situation became intense under the enemy's pressure. In the sky over Saigon, the American helicopters from the American 7th Fleet flew uninterruptedly to Saigon to evacuate the escapers. President Tran Van Huong, despite having transferred power to General Yuen Bengman, he had come back to the vice president's residence to meet with Ambassador Martin. It was the last time the ambassador tried to convince him to leave the country, but Mr. Huong directly answered the ambassador as follows. "Mr. Ambassador, I understand that the present situation is dangerous. For what is happening now, the U.S. has also the responsibility. Now you advise me to leave the country. I thank you for that, but I have thought about that and I decided to stay in my country. I also understand that when the communists took Saigon, the people of South Vietnam would have to bear the suffering and shame. I decided to stay with them to some extent I decided to stay to share with them to some extent their sufferings and shame. I appreciate it very much for your visit." Captain Gung and I stayed at the guardroom and waited for a fight when the communists attacked Saigon. To follow the news, I asked the driver to go home and bring the Sony 10-band radio he just bought to follow the news from Saigon Broadcasting Station. Until 10 a.m. of April 30th, 1975, what we expected to happen happened. General Yuen Bengman announced his capitulation. Although I predicted that the final result would happen that way, but I did not believe that it would happen that fast and easy like that. I stayed inert when I heard General Yung Bengmin declared his capitulation. I was choked in tears at the news. I was truly a defeated soldier. A dark idea came up in my mind at that moment. A phone rang up, the voice of my wife sounding urgent on the phone with the noise of my children. I am speaking, honey. Please come home soon. Our children and I are waiting for you to take us home. Our children and I are at our eldest sister's waiting. Try to come home soon, honey. I answered her. Yes, I will be back right away after saying goodbye to my friends in the unit. After putting down the phone, I summoned all the military men in the unit. I choked when I said goodbye to them. I told them that we are defeated already. It is really sad, but we have accomplished the duties of a soldier until the very end. We are in the same situation. Nobody knows what will happen in the future. I wish you all the best of luck. For the moment, you can take everything in the Vice President's palace for your use. Despite my calmness, I still felt heavy in my heart and mind. I shook hands with and said goodbye to each person. I still wore my military uniform and drove a jeep. My driver, First Class Sergeant Zhang Yi, ran after me with the intention to drive the jeep, but I told him, "You can go home and take care of your wife who expects your first child." Sergeant Yi hugged me and cried. I could not hold my tears and said in a choked-up voice, "Be prepared and go home. She is waiting for you." I drove to Mr. Huong's private residence. The security guards opened the gate and let me in. Captain Gung just stepped out of the house and hugged me. I could not hold back tears, neither could Gung and the guards. The spirits of everybody at that time were shaking, in particular the losers whose futures would be lost. Gung said to me, "The old man did not sleep last night, sitting quietly in the room. The phone rang many times, but the old man said that we don't need to answer them." The old man is a familiar term we use to refer to Mr. Huong. Perhaps he thinks at this moment there would be no way to change the situation. Possibly the winners are looking for the ways to get in touch with him, but so he did not want to answer.
I said to Kuang, "Keep yourself calm. Let us wait for what is coming to us. We truly lost our country. Our fate was settled. Probably we will lose our freedom and our future will be dark. Try to take care of your family because there will be no other way." Kuang said to me, "The same to you. I wish you to be safe and lucky, but I don't know what I am thinking now." The farewell was quick. I told Kuang I had to say goodbye to Mr. Huong because I would think it will be hard to see him again. Kuang said, "Go ahead and see him. He is alone there." After Kuang's report, he stepped out of the room. I saw him and stood up to greet him. He shook my hand and showed me the seat. He looked so tired. I understand that, during the past days, with multiple events happening recently in the country, he had to work incessantly. The security system of the vice president was very busy with his incessant movement, particularly after the day President Thieu transferred the presidency to him. I looked at him and said, "How are you today, sir?" As usual, he tapped on my shoulder and said slowly, "I am well, don't worry." He continued, "You work very hard these days, but now that the country is lost, in the future, you and your family's lives will be harder. Nobody knows what will happen to our country. I don't know what to do because it exceeds all our expectations. It is unfortunate to our Vietnamese people." He did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, "For the past time, you and other officers have been very tired taking care of me. It is very unfortunate for our people." For a moment, he looked at me and continued, "For the past time, you and other officers have been so tired taking care of me. Please accept my appreciation. I wish you and all the officers and their families to be safe and lucky in the future." I looked at him with all my affection. We could not hold back our tears. I saw that he tried to hold back his sorrow. Sometimes he used his handkerchief to wipe his tears. He wanted to say more, but his voice was interrupted by emotion. He could not hold his tears when he looked at Kuang. I looked at him and said, "Don't worry, sir. Being a soldier, all difficulties are normal. Please do not worry about that." I pray that everything will be safe with you because you are the leader of the country. I worry if something bad would happen to you. He thoughtfully said to me, Don't worry for me. I have decided to stay. When I chose to stay in the country, I accepted every bad thing that might happen to me. I understood that when the communists took over the country, our people would be unfortunate and suffer immensely. To me, death is normal. I feel pity for the survivors. Feeling that my stay had been long enough, I stand up and said goodbye. I hugged him and said, I wish you all the best. It was past 12:30 p.m. on the 3475, 2 hours after Saigon had a new leadership. Kuhn showed me off at the gate. He gave me a long hug and wished me all of the best of safety and luck. I wished him the same and took my jeep to go back to Su Van Han Street to take my wife and children back home. The streets of Saigon were in disorder. The traffic regulations were not respected. I drove the jeep from his house to Phan Thanh Giang, Com Lý, Hiền Vương, Trần Quốc Toản, passing to Lý Thái Tổ. I saw a lambretta with the flag of the South Vietnam Liberation Front and a loudspeaker calling to destroy the Americans and their lackeys. I drove passing Cổng Hòa Street to Thanh Thái Street with great anguish. Finally, I went back to Su Van Han Street, picking up my wife and my children to go back home along the streets in turmoil during the time of changing ownership. I dropped my wife and children at the alley on Trần Quốc Toản Street to walk home. I drove the jeep to Cao Thang Street and parked there. A week later, I went back to Cao Thang Street. I saw the jeep was destroyed. I felt so painful at the sight. After the communists entered the Independence Palace for transfer of power with General Nguyen Van Minh, the broadcasting station of the Republic of Vietnam became the station of the Liberation Front. The new owners appealed the army of the Republic of Vietnam to put down their arms and obey the laws of the new government. In Saigon, the Military Administrative Committee of Saigon, Chợ Lớn, was established. The leader of the committee was Communist General Tran Van Huong. Following the order, the next day I presented myself at the office of General Secretary. The office of the Vice President is also situated on the Widom Street. After the process of declaring the curriculum vitae to the communist cadre who took control of the Vice President's office, I was held back for almost 2 hours. I thought I was held forever. However, after that, I was released to go home. The communists reminded me, You are set free, but remember that when there is an order, you have to present yourself immediately. You cannot escape from us. I thought I would be held forever because when the communist agent saw my curriculum vitae, he became bitter. He said, Was your rank major? I answered him, I wrote it on the paper you gave me. My rank was major. He asked again, Were you a major until the last moment? I said, That is right. I stayed until the last minute with my comrades in the army. Actually, before working with me, he had worked with other military personnel at the Vice President's office. That is the reason he became more difficult in questioning. He looked at me and said in a lofty tone of victory, He said, You look stubborn. Why didn't you run away like Thiệu, Kỳ, and Kim? I felt painful of what he said, but I replied calmly, You are a soldier and so am I. You should know how to follow orders. He looked at me and said, Now what do you think? Would you dare to contradict again? I still tried to be calm and answered, You are the winners, we are the losers. You can do to us whatever you want. It is up to you. I saw almost everybody was present that morning, but I did not see Captain Van Huong. I asked, but nobody knew. When I was leaving, there were about 5 or 6 military men. The staff sergeants of the communication unit were still around waiting to see if I was released or not. I remembered Staff Sergeant Yi, the Staff Sergeant Ngom of the communication unit, and someone else. I was held back for a rather long time, so they thought that I was arrested, but when they saw me getting out, they felt relieved. they said. "We thought you were held back. Yim, your driver, intended to go to let your wife know, but we told him to wait to see if they take you away. Fortunately, you were released. We did not have anything for breakfast yet, so we invite you to Pho Noodle Soup restaurant next to Le Widom Street before we depart, because we don't know when we would have a chance to meet again." We had pho noodle soup the last time and departed with a sad feeling. When we departed, I have been thinking of Kuang. I did not know why, since that morning I did not see Kuang. I worried a lot. A special sentiment for Kuang urged me to walk to Mr. Huong's residence to look for him and to see how Mr. Huong had been doing. When I arrived, the old bodyguard opened the door. His eyes were red and full of tears. I knew that there was bad news. I had no time to ask yet. Then the bodyguard started crying and let me know that Captain Van Huong had passed away. He said, "Captain Kuang committed suicide yesterday. His corpse is still on the divan bed in the house." I was so confused hearing the horrible news. I asked him again, "Is this true?" The loyal bodyguard said, "Sir, my boss is no longer alive." On entering, a picture struck my eyes as following. On the divan, Kuang's corpse is almost intact, still warm, the eyes not yet completely closed. Mr. Huong, wearing black lenses, was sitting at the upper end of the divan. Probably he was having a most painful moment at the departure of his own nephew, the one who cared the most for his safety. I bowed down my head to him and looked at the corpse of Kuang with great pain. Maybe when Kuang hugged me, he knew that he would never see me again. I used my hand to close his eyes and cried. I could not hold back my tears. Being a military man, I saw many dead people, but with Kuang's death, I felt extremely sorrowful. Later, I found out that Kuang and his wife had both attempted suicides, but Kuang's wife was still in agony. I understand that Mr. Huong was the one that suffered the most. He wore sunglasses as if he wanted to hide the dark color around his eyes, because the country was destroyed by the communists of Vietnam. He suffered because of the loss of his beloved nephew close to him. There would be no other suffering for him at this moment, when he saw so many painful calamities happening to the country and families when we are powerless. Seeing that I stayed quiet looking at the corpse of Kuang, he said, "Kuang left me for another place. I feel sorry for him as for you. He was young and had a long future. The situation today will have to change. What is against the will of the people will not survive." He stopped for a moment and continued, "Actually, the way we unified the country should go from the south to the north, not from the north to the south. But the fate of our country will not happen as we wish. Our country has a long war, but when the war ends, the suffering of the people does not end. I do not care for myself, but I do care for our people. Don't do what Kuang did. Be more courageous if you can." He stopped for a moment and said, "The way you travel later would be hard. Anybody who lives under the communist regime will suffer, but any communist regime will collapse because it will not be appropriate later on. The future of our people one day will be better. So be courageous. Go ahead and do not give up when facing obstacles like Kuang." I saw that it would be better to leave, so I stood up and said goodbye to Mr. Huong, the last farewell to Kuang with a vague sorrow. Later, when I was in the U.S., I found Mrs. Kuang was still alive. She lives with her son in the U.S. Nephew Phang Jung-hyu is successful and is a journalist for the Orange County Register. At one time, Hugh went back to Vietnam to see his grandmother and granduncle Huong. He wrote a book after his trip back to Vietnam. The title of the bilingual book is Cội nguồn Bất an, or Roots of Unrest. He gave me one. I've known Kuang since he graduated as a warrant officer and became a platoon leader of 1st Company of the 1st Battalion of the Capital Military Zone. At that time, I was 1st Lieutenant as the deputy commander of this unit. Kuang was a righteous person. He always accomplished what he was assigned to do. Goong was in the same unit with me for a short time before he was transferred to the office of the Prime Minister when Mr. Huong was Prime Minister. At that time, Goong wanted me to be transferred to work with him at the Prime Minister, but I declined. For a long time later, when I was assigned to work at the G3 of the Capital Military Zone for a rather long time, and Mr. Huong joined President Tran Van Huong in the same slate, Goong requested to assign me to work at the Vice President office until the country was lost. The day when I went to Mr. Huong's residence on his nephew Fang Zhenghu's birthday, Goong introduced me to Mr. Huong. During the meal at Mr. Huong's private residence, I still remember, I was introduced to Mr. Huong, who invited me to sit at the table after I stood up and bowed to him the way an officer does to his superior. He kindly told me to join him for lunch. He took a bowl, and he himself put rice in the bowl to give it to me. He warmly said, "Hi, dear. Serve yourself as if you are in your family. Goong told me about you. He wanted you to come to work here. How do you think?" Facing Mr. Huong's kindness, I was deeply moved. Since I had been seeing him for a long time through the newspapers, radio, and television, his roles as mayor, prime minister, I respected him for his integrity and his virtues. That day was the first time I met him in person at a copious meal of his family. I could see that he was a really respectable person. I realized that I had no other ways but to accept the new responsibility at the Vice President's office. I said, "I appreciate Captain Goong's confidence in me to nominate me to work at the Vice President's office, and I thank you for your approval to me at your office. I will do all my best to accomplish the responsibilities of an officer assigned to me." On Monday morning the following day, by the order of the Capital Military Zone, I presented myself at the office of the Vice President and worked there until the loss of the country on April 30th, 1975. Actually, I was a little surprised because Goong did not let me know in advance about his intention to request for me to work at the Vice President's office. For a long time, Goong had been contacting me very often, since he had started working with Mr. Huong when he was the Prime Minister. Goong often invited me to Mr. Huong's private house where Goong resided and worked with him, where I had never been because I would not feel comfortable being such places. One day, when I came back home from work, I received a short, hastily written letter to my house that went as follows. "Dear Captain, today I have come to your house a few times, but you have not been back, so I wrote this letter and earnestly invite you to attend the birthday of my first child. I hope you would not refuse. First Lieutenant Van Huong." With such an earnest invitation, I told my wife to buy a gift, and on that Sunday I brought the gift for Goong's son. Goong welcomed me at the front door and smiled. "Actually, today is not the birthday of my son. I told you that story just to invite you to come and have lunch with my family." Goong was the one who made the arrangement because he wanted me to work at the Vice President's office with him.
I remember clearly the special day, and I'm so grateful to him, an officer I respect. I remembered the very thoughtful and warm attitude of Mr. Huong. I remembered the very simple meal of the Vice President with vegetables and fish. The work assigned to me actually did not give me any chance to be close to Mr. Huong. Only during the days of turmoil, the last days of Black April, I actually had a chance to come close to him. However, every people who had a chance working at the Vice President's office recognized he was simple, kind, and respectable. During the time working at the Vice President's palace, the security for Mr. Huong was the first priority, but he did not want the security service to be so obvious with a large number of escort agents that followed wherever he went. He did not want to bother the public, as he often reminds other people. However, there has been an attempt to kill him when he was Prime Minister. Some public opinions on him are erroneous, with the ideas that Mr. Huong is too old to be sharp enough to manage the country's affairs. I had a chance to observe sometimes when he replaced President Tran Van Huong to chair the meetings. Mr. Huong responded the questions very clearly to the points in questions. As Vice President, he proved himself clear and competent to administer the country. He firmly masters the problems of each situation. As a Vice President, he has been very close and simple to all personnel. Many times I saw the security office open the gate and let the roadside cart selling noodles get into the vice president's palace. A moment later, the office of guards announces that all were invited to eat noodles by Mr. Huong. Then all military officers and civil servants got together on the noodle roadside cart and ate noodles with him. At this moment, I saw that he was very close to everybody. He was very friendly, shook hands, and talked familiarly. Very often at the vice president's palace, I saw him wear old and ragged t-shirts. People in his family let me know that he does not want to discard his old clothes. He said, "There are a lot of people who do not have clothes and shoes to use. We should not waste them. Nothing is wrong with the little tear." Here's what an aunt in the family told us. With regards to the soldiers, he always cares for the hardship they are bearing and follows situations of war. One time, I was assigned to take some gifts from him to distribute to the widows and children of the deceased militaries at the 5th Infantry Division in memory of the 10 years of its establishment. At that time, Brigadier General Jung Wooklit was commanding the 5th Infantry Division at Lai Khe. Then, when hearing the news that Lieutenant General Do Cao-ji passed away by helicopter accident in an operation, he cried and said, "The Republic of Vietnam just lost a talented general in a serious situation of country during the invasion of enemy from the north." I still remember what Captain Kuhn told me. When he heard the sudden death of Lieutenant General Do Cao-ji, the 3rd Corps started the operation surrounding the communists when they used the land in Laos and Cambodia to infiltrate South Vietnam. Mr. Huong cried and was very sad. Beside his concerns about leading the country, understanding that war is atrocious and the life of soldiers is difficult, Mr. Huong still has compassion for the unfortunate people in the society. He was very concerned about the lepers at Yilin leprosy camps. He understands the efforts of the hard workers at the camp, typically the efforts in the charitable heart of Father Jean Kassain, a person who spends his whole life for the love of the lepers of the camp. Mr. Huong sent 2 high-level persons to take the highest level medal of the Republic of Vietnam to Father Jean Kassain on April 12, 1973. When he decided to stay in Vietnam, he understood the vengeance of the communists on the military, cadres, political personnel of the Republic of Vietnam. He frankly refused to accept the right of citizenship when the Vietnamese communists planned to return to him as a form of propaganda. He refused and said in his letter to the Vietnamese communist leaders as follows. At present, there are still hundreds of thousands of personnel of the regime, including civil and military, from the Vice Prime Minister, ministers, generals, military men, civil servants of all levels, politicians, religious leaders, political parties who are grouped in the re-education camps, who wondered why they were kept for so long. I am the top leader of the Republic of Vietnam. I will take all the responsibility by myself. I request the new government to release all of them because they were only the ones who took orders from their superiors. They're all innocent. Whenever all the people who are kept for re-education are released, whenever they receive their full right of citizenship at that time, I would be the last person to receive my right of citizenship for myself. For all his life, from being a teacher to being involved in the position of leadership for 2 times as mayor of Saigon, 2 times as prime minister, and 1 time as senator, vice president, and president during the last moment of the country, Mr. Huong proved to have a strong determination, loyalty to his country and his people. He appears to be a person full of integrity who loves his people and his country that few people could be. Now that he no longer survives, but the brilliant example of a gentleman who sacrifices his life for his people and his country, who lives a clean and poor life in every situation. His example as a man who loves his country and his people and his virtue affects the admiration of the people who work with him. He departed on 1/27, 1982, the year of Nhâm Tuoc on the lunar calendar. In memory of Mr. Tran Van Huong, every year, we, some officers working at the Vice President's office, get together at Captain Tran Van Huong, an attaché officer who was assigned to be close to Mr. Huong in any cases. Captain Huong worships him of the family as his own father. We love and respect Mr. Huong because we understand him so much. He was the one who worked so hard for the country, and he suffered the common pain of the country under oppressive dictatorship. Some pictures taken at Mr. Wing Vung Yuk with all of us to celebrate and remember the day of Mr. Huong's death. But besides these pains, he has his own anguish because he has not accomplished the responsibility of a leader during the turmoil of the country. However, in history, he has left to the posterity a bright example of real patriotism. We always pray to him, his nephew, Captain Feng Ho-kung, to live a peaceful world. Major Nguyen Janchuk, Chief of Military Service Office, Vice President, Military Department, translated into English by Professor Jung Ganswang in San Diego.